with Louise. Oh, there we are. All right. Spacious way to start. Dead air and raggedy cough. Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to a break time broadcast here at my regular day job for the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins Truerty, also known online in many places as Byron Sidious. And I actually wanted to touch upon the topic for today's show, for this brief program, the five primary breeds of fear. In the horror genre, the emotional impact that is conveyed to readers or viewers of the program in question tends to be along the lines of disturbance. That is the raison d'etre, as it were, of horror genre material. It unsettles and disturbs its audience. And the aim is not just to give them the heebie jeebies or make them uncomfortable or as though they are haunted in their own skin. The purpose of horror as a genre has for a long time been to compare and contrast the ethics and social mores of a given time period in which the material is produced and presented, and to also give people a touch of mortality and danger, a sense of doom, without coming into actual risk of direct contact with their own doom. Sorry, off here. Sorry about that. But is fear is something that we need as human beings. It's a survival mechanism. The response of terror to our environment is one that has, since the species crawled up out of swamps or out of forests or wherever human, your particular bloodline stems from evolutionarily. Fear is an element that helped your ancestors get to the point where you are here walking upright today, watching this presentation on your laptop, on your desktop, or on your phone, depending on how you're looking at this material or listening to it. Fear played a part, whether you appreciate that reality or not. Human beings respond to fear in order to maintain their survivability so that they can go on to the process of reproducing and making more of themselves in a blending of other genetic code to continue on the species. If we're not afraid, we would all die off pretty quick. Horror genre fiction tends to play on one of the five primary breeds of fear, and I'm going to touch upon those right now. The five primary types of fear are fear of the known, which is often also ascribed to the sense of disgust. Fear of the unknown, which is the one that oftentimes gets talked about and discussed heavily in theological and philosophical circles. Sudden fear, or jump scares, as they're also known, instinct reaction and response. You get a lot of these, especially with slasher flicks from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Then there's atmospheric dread, or building fear, where the sense of the environment, of the story itself, the details are off kilter, slightly askew. They don't seem to fit with proper reality as we know it. There is an unknown, unspoken awfulness that settles in and that can drip from every inch of the environment that the story takes place within. This can take this can be comprised of things such as the environment the characters are within, the attitudes and responses of wildlife or just nature to characters within a story. And it can even be enhanced by the word choice of the storyteller in question, who is presenting the tale that you are partaking of. H.P. Lovecraft was quite masterful in his application of atmospheric dread and building a sense of doom and terror. The fifth kind of fear is one that is not often talked about and is much more difficult to analyze from a direct critique perspective, but it is fear of the self. And I might come back around to that for a bit. But let's take a look at our first type of fear of the known, which is also, again, as I mentioned briefly, responsible for our disgust response or reaction. Fear of the known is something along the lines of if you are hurtling along in the passenger seat of a motor vehicle with one of your buddies or a family member and they have fallen asleep at the wheel, you will suddenly be in great fear for your physical safety and well being. Because it is obvious that if the operator of the motor vehicle is rendered unconscious, you're probably going to get hurt and or die. This is an understandable fear. There's a known quality to it. This would also be something along the lines of those things in life or in the world around us that can cause phobias. If you're not phobic of, let's say, spiders, which is where we get arachnophobia, if you simply have a respect for venomous spiders that you know happen to be in your area, or you can clearly identify a nearby, let's say, a timber rattlesnake, you hear the rattle, and you know that some of them reside in the area. Even if you don't see them, you've heard it. You know they live in the area, and you know that their bite is deadly. This is a fear of known circumstances. You don't want to come into contact with this creature. Not because you don't know what it'll do to you, but because you very much know what the consequences will be of a negative interaction with this particular critter. Likewise, if you are, say, participating in some kind of athletic exercise like a parkour event, for some reason you sign up and decide to do a parkour free run course through the downtown area of whatever city you live nearby. And just before you start off on your parkour run, you hear gunshots on the next block. You may not know where the gunshots are coming from, but you're familiar with the sound of gunshots and you know what a gunshot wound can do to a person. You are fearful of going forward because you know you could get dead quickly if you proceed. That is a fear of the known. Something else that is a fear of the known. Things that are terminal by their nature, such as certain rare or exotic diseases, even something not quite so rare or exotic, such as cancer. If you are diagnosed as being in a late stage term of cancer, the chances are good that you will not recover. This is a known element, a known variable that you are informed of by your medical practitioner or oncologist. They go through and tell you, we're sorry, it is advanced to stage 3. At that point, you know the statistics are not bearing out in your favor for survivability. It's not that you don't know what will happen. It's you very much know what could and will likely happen. So you are terrified of coming face to face with those known consequences and results. Moving along, we get into fear of the unknown. The most common question that most people associate with fear of the unknown is the following: where will I go when I die? For folks who don't have themselves anchored or rooted in a deep and personal faith based explanation for what will occur to them after their mortal demise, this can be an absolutely bone chilling question to find themselves poking and prodding at, either spoken aloud or just left unspoken, drifting back and forth through their mind. Because we do not have hard and fast, tangible, demonstrable, laboratory reproducible results and lab tests for the question of what happens when we die, the result is an unknown factor. We don't know what the result will be, what's going to happen when we pass away. Those of us who are people of faith, we have a fairly good certainty, and that grants us a great deal of solace if the question were to be posed, well, what do you think is going to happen to you when you die? If you genuinely believe in your heart of hearts that you've been a decent person and led a fairly moral and ethical life, and that you have tried to the best of your ability to adhere to the tenets of your particular given faith, you're going to lean more towards a naturally calmer reaction to the unknown because you believe that it is known what will happen. And that renders that particular fear non applicable to you. But if someone with a deep grasp on, with a hard grasp on logical argumentation and the Socratic method breaks through your faith based defenses, justifications, and explanations, it can still shake you up a little bit if they pose the question, well, how do you know that? Can you prove your claim? Because remember, folks, when it comes to Socratic logical argumentation, any claim in a positive direction is what must be backed up and proven through evidence and fact in finding. Saying, I believe X, Y, or Z is not itself proof of X, Y, or Z. Likewise, if you are walking into your home, say after a long day of work, it's dark, you don't want to turn the lights on and wake anybody up, but you hear a thump and a scrape somewhere further off in the darkness of the house. You don't know what made that noise. You don't you can't immediately identify the degree of the threat that you are under. It is an unknown factor, and that unknown nature of the threat torques up the volume and the effect of that threat and that terror upon you. Don't know what is out there in the dark. The only way to find out is to put yourself at risk. That's part of what makes fear of the unknown so unpleasant to contend with, is because the moment you confront the answer to the question of what's going on here, it now becomes a fear of the known unless what you are encountering is something beyond human experience. And then you are still terrified because it's still unknown. And having something right in front of you that you can't explain tends to result in a fear or terror response. Sorry about that. Moving on. The next type of fear, sudden fear, the jump scare. While often used in films and television shows as a cheap fake out to get people to go and gasp and clutch their chest or suck in their breath to get that immediate adrenaline dump and dopamine hit. This is a instinctive type of fear. It plays upon our primitive rear brain responses relies heavily on tapping into the lizard brain within each of us. Our response normally, when abruptly and unexpectedly being confronted with a threat, is what is classically known as the fight or flight response. Though there is a great deal of more recent documentation in psychological and physiological studies and journals stating that there's actually three variable responses. There's fight, flight, or freeze. Freeze is the worst because freeze is not a response at all. It leaves you a sitting duck, completely vulnerable to the whims of whatever circumstance or creature you are about to have a more than likely negative interaction with. Suddenly, you come around a corner and suddenly come face to face with the mountain lion, and you go and you lock up. Well, guess what? You're going to be a plaything for Kitty on the string ball. Only the string will be your guts, and instead of petting the kitty, you'll be begging for God to make it go away or end you quickly. Colorful, I know, but there you have it. The next type of fear, atmospheric fear, dread, building fear. As I mentioned before, this often begins with an uncertain environment, a sort of surreality that seems to infect everything. It begins as call here. Oh, okay, sorry, not for me. Lost my train there, but it's a sense of something is off, something's not quite right. The works of H.P. Lovecraft are largely responsible for the establishment of a subgenre of horror referred to as cosmic horror. One of the key facets or traits of cosmic horror is that it tends to leave the reader with a sense of absolute absurdity and smallness, that human beings are petty little things, specks of dust in the grand scheme of the universe's chaotic unplans. That there are creatures, forces, natures out within the galaxy's infinite stretch that are so beyond our pathetic human comprehension that for us to think there's anything more to us than a blip on the span of time and barely more than the rustling notice of a pimple on the ass of some giant, larger than a planet essence or being that will trawl its way through the galaxy, randomly lashing out one of its goo covered tentacles to whip our sanity completely out of our bodies and minds. That we are left hopeless, that we are left trembling, trying to draw some comfort from wherever we possibly can. Yet even in those moments where we turn to that which gives us joy, we find that it has been coated over with a layer of permanent shadows, like a black blanket, cozy but suffocating. That is atmospheric dread. And lastly, fear of the self. Now, I mentioned before, but this is not a type of fear or a breed of fear that is often touched upon. Certainly not in most most modern day horror genre literature that I've come across. I do read quite a bit of horror and fantasy, but when I do come across it, it tends to be intriguing because it delves more into the psychology of the characters or creatures that are questioning their own sanity, their own capacities for violence, for destruction, for dismay and mayhem, than it is something to just be trembling or shivering about. A fine example is in the book, The Howling, not the movie. The movies were the first one, at least, was fairly closely based upon the novel. Don't ask me what happened to the second movie. That was based on a bad acid trip, from what I could tell. But the second book, the novel, The Howling 2, was also quite brilliant. But in the first Howling book, the husband, who ultimately ends up becoming a member of the lycanthrope species, when he first gets bit and under this first night where he begins feeling that his body is undergoing metamorphosis into the beast, he is absolutely terrified of what he is becoming. He has never felt this way. He's never felt this bloodlust, this urge to hunt and track and stalk and kill, or to devour that which he catches with his own two hands or snout. The entire mindset of going from thinking like a bipedal, upright, walking, thinking, rational human being is now being wiped away. It's being changed over into the thought process of a four-legged beast that can sprint faster than any Olympic athlete, can chase down animals as large as a caribou or an elk and render them into so much mewling, bleeding meat to be gnashed and swallowed through the jaws and throat. We don't know what we're capable of, not at least until we are pushed into responding to an overwhelming threat. There are some folks out there who genuinely don't know what they might do under circumstances X, Y, or Z and find themselves disturbed by the possibility that they might become absolutely monstrous. And this is, I think, also finally demonstrated in a classic horror tale, The Curious Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is itself a form of lycanthrope tale if you think about it. The difference between your standard wolf lycanthrope or skinwalker type mythology and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the introduction of chemicals and scientific experimentation to awaken the Jungian shadow within the good Dr. Jekyll, thus unleashing the savage and low thinking, knuckle dragging Mr. Hyde, a fellow so contemptuous and so brutal that while knocking over a street urchin child, rather than apologizing and helping the girl up, he stamps on her face as hard as he can in order to not slow down while walking down the street over her. This is an unpleasant scene, and if you've never read it for yourself, I highly recommend you get a copy of The Curious Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and give it a read. It is a wonderful tale, even given some of the challenges of the linguistics and choices of archaic terminology utilized during its penning, but it still conveys a sense of absolute brutality. And when Jekyll hears about what happened, what Mr. Hyde did to this child, this girl, who could be no older than 8 or 9 years old, that he stamped her head in because he was too busy getting to where he was going to give a tin shite about whether or not he hurt the girl, much less as they apply, though they don't directly state in the novel, may very well have killed her. And he was never aware that that capacity was within him prior to ingesting the elixir to unlock his inner beast. Fascinating that that book predates the work of Carl. I have to wonder if some of his shadow work may have been inspired, as it were, by stories such as that of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, mythology, the skinwalkers, and the blade of the werewolves. But anywho, that's going to do it for me for tonight's breakdown show, covering these five primary breeds of fear. There weren't any live chats during the broadcast, so I assume folks are either over in Hypnotic's show. He's doing a presentation, a live show like he does every Sunday. There's also Tilted Cajun, who's a good fellow, also primarily over on YouTube. He hasn't made the jump over here to Rumble yet. I do wish he would do that. Well, I'm on both right now myself, but Hypnotic is on both. Those gentlemen talk more about video games, films, television shows, pop culture, kind of current events of the day. Um, but I also didn't want to come on in my first break because at the time I was watching uh, Jesse and his wife at the Gray Matters show. I'd recommend giving them a follow if you are so inclined as well to hear a little bit more about politics from a Minnesota perspective. And except on Sundays, Sundays is a non-political show between Jesse and his wife. I'd also highly recommend Dear Sarge, especially if you are a fan or a viewer of material on the video uploading site BitChute, which is another fantastic alternative to the alphabet-powered monstrosity that is YouTube. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.